Hello and welcome back to Reimagining Cyber. Now, over the past several years, cybersecurity has undergone a major shift. We've heard repeatedly that identity is the new perimeter. Organizations have invested heavily in MFA, identity providers, zero trust architectures, and access controls. But recently, we've seen a number of attacks targeting something much more familiar: VPNs, firewalls, and remote access systems. So today we're asking a simple question: did we forget about the perimeter? Well, joining me as always is our very own cybersecurity expert, Tyler Moffitt. Great to have you back.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. I appreciate it. I don't think the industry is wrong when it says that identity is the new perimeter. I think where things got a little sideways is, people sort of interpret it to mean that the old perimeter no longer mattered. But it does, because attackers are still attacking it. They never got that memo. If they find a vulnerable VPN sitting on the internet that gives them access to an environment, they're going to abuse it every single time, right? Attackers really don't care what security buzzword is trending this year. They're looking for the path of least resistance, the easiest way inside.
Yeah, let's start there then. Why did identity become such a dominant security topic over the past few years?
Probably because that's like the most common way people are breaking in, right? Or you wouldn't even call it breaking in, because it's incredibly effective. They're just logging in, right? We saw credential theft basically explode. Phishing campaigns became more sophisticated. Insert AI in there as the, why phishing is, growing increasingly more convincing and at scale. They're compromising more. Token theft increasing. MFA fatigue is now a big deal. And help desk social engineering, scattered spider. We talked about them, I think, last week. They're a major issue and illustrated a big problem with, the help desk, scam, if that makes sense. They're not relying on modern advanced malware. They're not, exploiting 0 days, necessarily. They're just manipulating people, right? Social engineering, resetting passwords, pretending to be an employee, trying to get back into their system. And they convince them, they take over identities, they access cloud resources. Identity is now the primary battleground because attackers have found that it works. And, the industry is right to focus there.
Where do you think things started to shift?
I don't know if it ever shifted, sort of defenders shifted and attackers kept basically doing both. I would say as far as the help desk IT scam, that became popular like over the past year, not even 2 years. It's like fairly fresh, right? Security teams were investing heavily in identity protection. Attackers still continued, as they've always done, to scan the internet looking for vulnerable devices, right? Vulnerable VPNs, firewalls, remote access appliances, things like that, stuff on the edge. And they never abandoned that because that works and you can automate it. They just basically expanded their playbook and attack both sides now.
So then, why are these devices still so attractive?
Yeah, because they're exposed, right? I mean, MongoDBs, it's like your remote access embedded through Microsoft. That was a real big problem, like 2018, 2019. Port 3389. I mean, it was just you're leaving it exposed, right? VPNs, they sit on the internet. Firewalls sit on the internet. Remote management systems, they sit on the internet, and attackers can find them and scan for them automatically. They don't need a phishing email. They don't need a user to click on anything. They don't need any social engineering. It's just, is it open, accepting connections, and can I abuse it? Is it, does it vulnerable versions? Can I exploit them? And if I can, great. I'll move on. It's efficient. It's scalable. You can automate it. And ransomware groups, love scalability.
And we're seeing that play out again right now then.
Absolutely. I mean, it never really stopped. If you look at the past several years, the names changed, but the patterns stay the same. So Ivanti, Fortinet, SonicWall, Checkpoint, Citrix, Pulse Secure, whatever. Like, there's so many out there. Any specific vendor isn't really the story here. I'm not going to pick on any one, but they all make these appliances. They all have vulnerabilities. They all need to be patched, right? The story is that whenever a critical vulnerability appears on one of these devices, ransomware groups move incredibly fast as soon as they can on it, right? And sometimes within days, literally. And with AI, it could be hours now, and they're not, they're exploiting the systems before organizations even realize that there's a patch. Let alone the dwell time and them knowing to then fully patching and taking care of that issue, it's that gap is a problem.
So you've got, so much discussion around cloud security and identity, but the attackers, they're still finding success with, pretty traditional techniques.
Yeah, honestly, that's one of the most important lessons here. They're opportunists, right? If stealing credentials works, they're going to steal credentials. If exploiting a VPN or edge device works, they're going to exploit it, right? If it's social engineering, calling a help desk employee, pretending to be, somebody trying to get in, and that works, they're going to keep doing that. They aren't choosing sides in like what they feel is philosophy and the best way in, and trying to like commit to that. They're just going to go with what gets results.
Now, one thing you've talked about before is patch windows and also about timing as well being such a critical factor. Could you just underline that for us one more time?
Yeah, I guess I should dive into that a little bit. Ransomware operators, they're really efficient. Let's say a vendor releases a patch today, right? A login organizations think, great, we'll patch by next week or something like that, or we'll schedule it during next maintenance cycle or next month. I don't know. You talk to many different people at some of these security conferences, and they've got many different philosophies around it, right? And the attackers are thinking, great, we know exactly what that vulnerability fixed. Let's go and abuse that. Make something for that vulnerability. The clock starts immediately, right? Every day that passes becomes additional risk. And this is where vulnerability management becomes so important, right? Most organizations don't get breached the day a patch is released. They get breached weeks or even months because their patching was delayed. That gap is too large.
And it seems like a pretty common story.
Yeah, it's literally, I would say, the most common story. I mean, we talk about this all the time. We're always talking about fundamentals and patching, and I'm never probably not gonna stop talking about it, right? The breach isn't caused by a lack of awareness. It's caused by like operational readiness, right? Testing, change management, limited resources, fear of downtime. I get it. All of those are concerns. But attackers also understand them as well, and they know you can't patch everything instantly. So those first few weeks are like, after disclosure are clearly the most dangerous.
Tyler, one thing that I've noticed is that every time there's a major vulnerability disclosure, executives, they seem relieved once it's been identified and a patch is available, but that isn't necessarily when the risk goes away, is it?
Well, yeah, that's the biggest misconception that I see, at least talking to executives, is because, when they hear about these vulnerabilities becoming known, they're like, great, we know about it. It can be solved. It can be fixed. And they're right in the sense that, hey, look, something that had a hole was plugged, but it's like kind of the opposite. Like, once a vulnerability becomes public, attackers know exactly where to focus, right? Researchers, they publish the details, and the vendors release the patches, but you've got to patch it, right? There's that dwell time between security teams, talking about it and actually implementing the patches to all the systems. And attackers begin immediately scanning organizations that haven't patched right. And the period right after disclosure is often when organizations, I would say, are at the highest risk. The danger isn't just the vulnerability itself; it's that dwell time between it becoming known and then you actually patching it, right? And criminals are way faster on the track to releasing something to actually exploit it before you're able to patch it, and that's the biggest misconception.
Yeah, that's a really interesting way to think about it. Most people, I guess, would assume that the danger period is before anyone knows about it.
Yeah, well, I mean, there are situations where that is true, especially with 0 days. But for many organizations, the bigger risk comes, afterwards. Yeah, how many breach headlines start with critical vulnerability was exploited, right? That's like a lot of them. Maybe even you could say half or more, at least the ones you hear about. You read further and discover the patch was available for weeks or months, or even longer, right? But the lesson isn't always the vulnerability was unstoppable. It's that, the attackers and defenders are racing. Who gets to the finish line first? And the attackers got there first.
Which brings us back to vulnerability management.
Yeah, I mean, when people hear about vulnerability management, they usually think like compliance exercises and spreadsheets and having red teams poke holes and all these things that are super old. And I would say while that is a core of it for sure, Vulnerability management is really about that dwell time, reducing the amount of time attackers have to exploit something, right? Shorter that window is, the harder their job becomes.
And this throws up an interesting debate, I suppose. Identity versus vulnerability management. Which do you think is more important?
I reject that. I think they're both important. Please give me both.
All right.
That's like asking what's more important in your house, the front door or the windows. Um, I think they're both pretty important, and you should have both. Identity absolutely matters. MFA matters. Conditional access matters. You know, the dwell time of the token time to live matters. Zero trust matters. But if your VPN is vulnerable and exposed to the internet, attackers are going to bypass all of that and just come right in the window or the door, whichever one the analogy is. But you need both, right? I we said that I think there was a couple episodes when we were talking about the Verizon DBeer report. Identity is the new perimeter, but vulnerability management is still the unlocked window.
Right.
And I think that there's reality today and of modern cybersecurity in general.
Yeah, you're loving the door window analogy there, aren't you?
I am. But I mean, it's because it reflects what we're actually seeing. Attackers don't care whether they're using identity abuse, social engineering, credential theft, or exploitation of devices or cloud compromise malware, whatever. They're looking for the path, again, of least resistance. The moment defenders become overly focused on a single security domain, and defenders ramp it up, they're going to start looking somewhere else. So it's all about what's working.
Okay, we love to wrap up all reimagining cyber episodes with the practical considerations. What should organizations and IT teams be focused on?
Yeah. Some of these going to sound a little familiar with their fundamentals, and you've got to. I'm gonna drill them into you if I need to.
Okay.
You have to know what internet facing systems you have, right? It sounds obvious, but you'd be surprised how many organizations don't have a complete inventory of everything they have exposed to the internet, and that's important, right? You can't protect what you don't know exists. Second, prioritize patching those internet facing assets, right? Not every vulnerability deserves the same urgency, for sure. I mean, obviously you have the CISO reports, and they help us sort of categorize level 9s, level 10s, things like that. But a vulnerability sitting on an exposed VPN or firewall or remote access system, that's like category 10, right? Because attackers can reach it directly, and then boom, that's their back door or the way in, right? Third, I guess, continue investing identity security, right? MFA, review privileged access, monitor for suspicious authentication activity, right? Lesson from today's discussion isn't that identity doesn't matter. It absolutely does. They both matter. But it's organizations, can't afford to focus on identity while ignoring everything else. You got to do both. And fourth, I would say reduce unnecessary exposure when possible, right? If a service doesn't need to be internet facing, don't expose it. Every system you publish to the internet, it's just another opportunity or attack surface for the bad guys. And sometimes the best security control is simply just removing something from that attack surface entirely.
Good advice. Any other bits and pieces at all?
I would challenge, listeners, look at breaches and the headlines differently now. Every time you hear about a breach, don't go, oh, what was the vulnerability was used? I would look at it as how long was that patch available, right? Because that's usually the lesson there, is that a lot of breaches it's not some unstoppable crazy exploit. It's attackers basically just finding that for this particular device that might, for whatever reason, have a lot of organizations sitting on it for a while before they patch and haven't closed that window yet. That's what they're going to go after.
So, as we bring things to a close, Tyler, if there's one takeaway from today's discussion, what would it be?
Industry is right. Identity is very important. We shouldn't confuse that, thinking the perimeter disappeared. Attackers never stop targeting internet-facing systems. They still do just as much as they possibly can anything else, I would say that identity is just it's got the spotlight right now. And every time we see ransomware groups exploiting VPNs, firewalls, remote access systems, whatever, any edge appliances, you're reminded that the fundamentals are like still sky high, the most important. Patch management, asset visibility, exposure reduction. I mean, those things you've been hearing those for 10, 15 years, right? They aren't flashy. They don't generate headlines like AI or zero trust, but they still contribute to a tremendous number of attacks. So you got to watch out for them.
Great discussion as always. Thanks for joining us, Tyler.
Thanks for having me on, Ben.
Well, identity may be the new perimeter, but the old perimeter never went away. Attackers, they're happy to steal credentials, abuse MFA, or exploit a vulnerable VPN. The lesson isn't to choose one security strategy over another. It's to remember that cybersecurity fundamentals still win. Thanks so much for listening to Reimagining Cyber. We will be back next week. In the meantime, do remember to rate, review, and recommend the show. Goodbye.